Al Pincus, who previously lectured, I think, back in July of '98, and he's got a little tale to tell, which will sort of be a prelude to tonight's main lecture topic, the U.S. submarine operations in the Pacific. So, Al, chat for a while?
Which one?
Try that. See
This
if
one?
that's the one.
Is it working?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yes, Don called and said, he's on vacation now, well earned, because he works very hard for this organization. And he said, we want to try something new, because we now have those little meetings from 5:30 to 6:30, and then there's a lull in the proceedings until the speaker starts at 7 o'clock. So he said, I'm going to use you to see if it works. And we're going to take some of the old speakers who spoke before and let them give a little synopsis of their speech for about a half hour, and then go into the new subject for the evening. And I volunteered. I've always done that. They told me never to volunteer, but I always volunteer. Anyway, and he said, by the way, the subject for tonight is submarines, so I know you have a lot of stories. Could you tell a couple of stories about submarines? And I said, sure. You know how lawyers are. Wind them up. They'll talk on any subject, even if they don't know what the subject is. So, and we have so many new people that didn't hear my story, and those of you who did hear it, well, you're going to have to sit through it again. What can I say? I left he asked me to bring some artifacts, and I left them on the table in the back. The best one is the picture of that handsome sailor standing in front of his ship. And some nice lady, there you are, said, who's that? And I said, that's me at 21. So, a long time ago. Anyway, so let me tell you about the submarine stories. When the war broke out, two friends and I were in high school, and we didn't go to school that day. We went and joined the Navy, and we loved the Navy, all three of us, and we all survived. And the Navy then sent us to Purdue University to become electricians' mates. And we learned about electricity for a few weeks. We learned, like, don't stick your fingers in the thing, and stuff like that. And then we were separated, and I was sent to, and here comes the submarine story. I was sent to the submarine base. It was called Woman's Bay at Kodiak Island, Alaska. And I don't know if any of you have ever been there. Of course, it may be changed now, but in those days, it was desolate. It was like, blow it up. What do we need it for? And it was the first of the Aleutian chain that went out like a semicircle. And the first two of the chain were captured by the Japanese early in the war. And that famous, wonderful ship, now lying on the bottom, the USS Indianapolis, who delivered the atomic bomb, if you remember. And we'd been trying to clear the name of Captain McVeigh. Not an easy job. But in any event, that ship, with its constant bombardment, took back those two islands. And the interesting thing, it can now be told that if the Japanese had had a little more patience, they could have taken all those islands, because there was no armament on any of them except Kodiak. And all Kodiak had was two things: the Woman's Bay submarine base with one World War I submarine and two World War I destroyers, the Hatfield and the Fox. They were older than I am at the present time, and that's pretty old. So, and a bunch of green kids like myself to man them. If the Japanese had known that, they would have taken that island very easily. There was just an army base on the other side of the island with not too many people in that. So there I was at the submarine base, and I must have done something wrong one day, because I found myself on KP duty. I was peeling potatoes. And in those days, I was a fireman first class. You're an apprentice seaman, then you go to school, you learn to be an electrician, they make you fireman first class. That's an engineering rating. So I'm peeling the potatoes, and the cook comes in. You got to see the cook. He's been in the Navy 25 years, and he has hash marks. That's, every 4 years you get one. He had them up to his shoulder. And he says, I want to volunteer. I told you, I always volunteer. He says, and nobody says anything. And he said, the one who volunteers gets off KP. I said, I volunteer. What do I have to do? And he said, can you drive? Well, I didn't have a license. I was 18 years old, but my father used to have a garage, and I used to drive the cars around and move them around in the garage just to play around. And those of you who know me know my middle name is Carr. So, in any event, I said, yeah, I can drive. And he said, okay, I got a job for you, and then all is forgiven and you're off KP. He said, I baked 48 pies for the dog faces on the other side of the island. I didn't want to do it, but the commanding officer made me do it. He said, I stayed up all night baking these pies. I want you to put it in the 37 Chevy pickup and take it to the other side of the island. I said, a piece of cake. So we take the pies and we put them in racks. You've seen that little wooden rack. It looks like a bookcase, and you slide the pies in. Two racks made 48 pies. We shoved them in this 37 beat-up Chevy pickup truck. You know, the old-fashioned kind with the two doors in the back, and there's no windows or anything in the back. So I put it, he said, you sure you can drive? I said, of course. I can drive, Cookie, don't worry about it. So he said, now I'm going to give you a map, because there's no streets, nothing, there's no light, and of course, in Kodiak, Alaska, it's dark in the winter, 6 months out of the year, and it was the middle of winter. It was black as coal. And even the headlights had to be painted half in black. You know, you remember that? The top part had to be painted in black so they couldn't see you from upstairs. So he gives me the truck, and it had the stick shift on the floor, you know. And he said, now here's a map. You go to the dead tree, you make a right turn, you see a big rock, you make a left turn. Don't get lost, because we may never find you. Now I start to get a little worried, because, you know, my middle name was Wrong Way Corrigan. So I start driving, and now I see the rock, I make the right turn, I see the dead tree, I make the left turn. Now I'm driving. He said it would take about 20 minutes to get there. It's like 45 minutes, and I'm driving, I'm going up. And I said, what? Something's wrong. I better go back to the rock and see where I'm wrong. And he gave me a little flashlight so I could read the map. So I turned the truck around, and it, you know, very narrow road, and it's a dirt road. I turn around, and now I try to go forward, and the car isn't going, and I hear the wheels turning, but the car's not going. So I get out of the truck, and I look through the dark, and oh my Lord, one of the rear wheels is off the road, spinning around, the other one is on the road, and I look down, it's like I'm on top of a cliff. I said, well, if the Japs didn't get me, this is going to get me for sure. So I said, the only thing I could do, nobody to help you, you can't, no cell phones, you can't call. So I get in the car, and I put it in gear, and I give it everything she's got. And it catches and lurches forward. What happens? The 2 cases of pies go sliding back. They hit the doors, the door opens, and the pies, well, if you look at them, there's 48 flying saucers going down the mountain. Now I said, I should have gone down with them, because now I'm really in trouble. I finally find my way back in the wee hours, and the cook says, well, how'd it go? I said, Cookie, can we talk? You know. And he says, what happened? And I tell him the story. And he starts laughing. And I said, you know, I figured he was going to kill me. And he says, that's the funniest thing I ever heard. He says, and it serves those dog faces right. Pardon me, fellas, if any of you are in the Army. He said, I didn't want to do those pies anyway. He says, you want to make up? I said, yeah. He said, you got to do one thing. I said, what do I have to do? He said, we had mail call while you were out. Your mother sent you a salami. I said, how do you know? He said, I smelled it 2 miles before it got here. And he said, if we can make salami and eggs for the galley crew, all is forgiven. I said, oh, that's easy, okay. We open up the package, you know, the Fleet Post Office. It took 6 weeks to get there, and it's solid green mold. I said, oh my God, Cookie, throw it away. He said, that's what you know about food. Turns on the hot water, washes it off, peels the skin off. He said, this is going to be the best salami you ever tasted in your life. He said, if it took another 6 weeks, it would be even better. He said, you know, I want to teach you something. If you ever get a salami again, hang it up in your locker and leave it there for about 3 months. It'll be gorgeous. So we had salami and eggs, powdered eggs, but it was the greatest salami and eggs I ever had in my life. And I was forgiven, and that was it. So the Japanese never knew those stories, and so they never came to Kodiak because they wanted to come along the Aleutian chain, come down and grab us from behind. But it didn't work, fortunately, because of the Indianapolis and because of Woman's Bay with all their armament, you know. So that was one submarine story, and then after that, I was transferred to destroyer escort. And if any of you here tonight served on a destroyer escort, please see me after I speak, because I just got a great book, the history of the destroyer escorts in World War II. And anyone that was attacked or that was hit or anything, they got a whole chapter on it. And that's why my daughter and son-in-law bought it for me, because they saw that it had the USS Chaffee, destroyer escort 230. That was my ship. And we picked up that ship when it was absolutely brand new, and took it through the Panama Canal and into the war. And in those days, they must have made 600 destroyer escorts. They were incredible. They were fast. And they were expendable. And they were knocking them out every couple of months. There was another one commissioned. So we ended up on all the island hopping, and finally got to Lingayen Gulf. That's in Luzon in the Philippines. And there were 70 destroyer escorts and an armada of ships that was huge. And it was a big battle. And there was in this book, and also in a famous book that Don always talks about, The Two-Ocean War by Admiral Sam Elliott Morrison. And it said that the D's really made themselves proud in that battle, with the exception of one. Only one, unfortunately or fortunately, got hit. That was the USS Chaffee. What happened was a kamikaze came down in an airplane, you know, and dropped an aerial torpedo. He came so close that we could see him, you know, and he didn't have time to properly arm the warhead. So the fish hit us in the bosun's locker below the waterline, went through and went out the other side, and then exploded. So we closed off the watertight bulkhead, of course, but we were listening like this, and then the propellers were still turning, and they caught on the coral reef, and we were hanging like a picture hanging from a wall, fighting all the way, all the time. And finally, the battle was over. We got towed to an LSM, that's an LSD, landing ship dock. And they took us in, patched us up, and we went back. But in the meantime, I got transferred. They said, anybody who volunteers for the new amphibious force gets a 30-day leave. And I had just gotten a Dear John letter from my girlfriend, so I wanted to see what John looked like. And I went, so I said, I didn't get the short straw, but the guy that got it he was from Pennsylvania, and he had 3 little kids, and he said, he was an old man, he was 32, for heaven's sake, and I was 20. And I said, I'll take it. I want the 30 days. Went home, didn't like the girl, came back. I didn't like John either, of course. And then we picked up our LSM and in Houston, Texas, and we went, and LSM was landing ship medium, and we would take soldiers and Marines and Jeeps and stuff like that. And if there were none, we would take equipment to make airfields, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so by this time I was electrician's mate first class, and I met somebody here tonight, believe it or not, who was on an LSM, and we both went to different LSMs, but we both went to Sperry Gyro Compass School in Brooklyn, New York, to learn how to run the gyro compass and keep the ship afloat. So we went with that ship, believe it or not, 205 or 210 foot long, 54 men and 6 officers, a flat bottom. And every time it went up on a swell and it came down, you almost lost your teeth. But it made it all the way to Japan, all the battles, and all the way back to Bremerton, Washington, where she was decommissioned. In any event, what happened was when we got to the end of the war, and they were signing the peace treaty on the Missouri, we were part of that armada. And as soon as the war ended, everybody was told, every commanding officer was told where he had to go to take over. And we were told to take over a little seaplane base off the coast of Japan. It was called Wakanura-wan. And so the captain said, at this time I was 21 and the captain was 28 or 29. Captain Charles W. Barnes of Pensacola, Florida. And he said, see how you don't ask me what I had for breakfast yesterday, but ask me who the captain was, I'll tell you. And he said, all right, man, I want you to put your best blue uniforms on. We have to look like the victors here. And, you know, he was gung-ho. And so we hit the beach, and this is like 55 minutes after the peace treaty is signed. And we're up on the beach, we dropped the stern anchor, we're up on the beach, and we have Marines aboard. And we're at battle stations, and my station is, I used to open the bow doors and lower the ramp so the soldiers could get off. So I got the earphones on, and the captain says to me, Sparks, are you there? Aye, aye, sir. Every electrician's mate is called Sparks, you know that. They had a common mother, the U.S. Navy. So anyway, says, open the bow doors. Aye, aye, sir. And I press all the couple of hammer switches. I was great at that. And the doors open. And then he says, lower the ramp. Aye, aye, sir. And I lower the ramp. Now, I used to have to look down to make sure that there were no stones or anything, because these soldiers would run off, you know, they'd trip and break a leg. So that was my job. I looked down, make sure everything was smooth, and then when I looked down, he couldn't see me because he's up in the con, you know. And he said, Sparks, are you there? I said, yes, Captain. He said, when you come up slowly. There's a Japanese major or colonel, somebody like that, standing in front of you with a sword in his hand and a bunch of sailors with rifles. Now, here I am, 21 years old, or 22 years old. And I'm from Brooklyn. You know, they're bad altogether. And I said, in my Brooklyn twang, Captain, do you think he knows the war's over? So he said, it beats me, so you better be careful. So I come up, and I'm standing, he's over here, and I'm over here, and he's got a Sunday best uniform on, and I see right away he's a commander. And he's looking at me with a little beard, a little mustache, and he's got about 30 or 40 sailors, and they're all holding rifles. And he's looking at me, I'm looking at him, and the Marines are getting nervous, and the captain says, don't anybody shoot, I don't want to be responsible for World War III. So everything is quiet for what seems like an eternity, but it's really only a couple of seconds. And then suddenly he says to me, Konnichiwa. You know, that's good day to you, sir. And he holds out the sword. And I'm standing there and I'm saying, why me? And the captain says, take it, stupid, he's surrendering to you. As soon as I took the sword, they all dropped their rifles and put their hands up, so they obviously got the word, thank God. And so, when you look at the stuff I brought that's on that back table, you'll see the sword, it's 200 years old, has the name of the family under the handle on one side and the name of the sword maker on the other side, and it has 3 notches. And I've owned it for 56 years, so you know that it's 200 years old. And the rifles that were dropped, the captain said, okay, Sparks, you get to keep the sword, because he was very fair, because he surrendered to you. Everybody else can take a rifle. So we took a rifle, and one of them was laying there. And we have a gentleman here today who I respect greatly. That's Wild Bill Bannon, who was sitting over there, an old Marine. And he invited me once to give this talk before the Navy League, and I gave it. And there was a fellow there who was an expert in arms. And he looked at the rifle and he said, you have a very, very valuable rifle here. I said, why? It's a piece of junk, you know. And he said, tell you why, because when the war ended, the Japanese were told, everybody take your rifle and file off the Emperor's chrysanthemum. That's his sign, because it's a sin if an American gets it. Well, mine has the chrysanthemum big as life on it. You can see it on the thing there, on the barrel, because it was too soon after the war ended. They didn't get a chance to do it. So that makes, there are many of those around, but not many of them that have the chrysanthemum. And now my last story is another submarine story, because I have to watch the time. Oh, I got another couple of minutes. So after the war, I wanted very much, I loved the Navy. I became like a nut, you know, and I never was on anything but a rowboat in Prospect Park. And all of a sudden, I'm in the Navy and I loved it, despite the fact that I was seasick once in a while. But I wouldn't, and they said, stay in the Navy, we'll send you to school and, you know, we'll make you an engineering officer. And I said, no, I want to go home. My dad is ill and I haven't been home for 2.5 years and so on. So I went home. And I remember that the executive officer on our ship was a professor at Minneapolis University, and he made me take courses. And he was like my teacher. Whenever we weren't fighting, we were studying. And he said, I said, why did you do that, Lieutenant? And he said, because I think you're the only guy in this ship that wore shoes before he came in the Navy. He says, and I don't want you to waste it. I want you to promise me that you're going to go back to school under the GI Bill. So I got home, had to go back to high school at age 22 to finish it. And when I became a lawyer, it was 1950. God, that's a long time ago. I've been a lawyer almost 50 years. And I should learn something by now. Anyway, when the Korean War broke out, just before the Korean War, I decided I'm going back to the Navy, and I want to be a JAG officer. So I made an application. They said, oh yes, we'll take you. You know, just became a lawyer, fine. Then the Korean War broke out, and I got a nice letter saying, we don't need JAG officers, we'll make you a line officer, a lieutenant, if you want to come back to the Navy for sea duty. And I said, no, thank you. 4 years of sea duty was enough. So that was the end of the career. And to this day, I wonder, should I or should I not have? I don't know. But anyway, since my Navy days, I've collected nautical antiques, you know, nautical artifacts. And some of you have been to my little private museum. And all of you are welcome at any time. And I do have a little museum. What's on that table in the back is only a little bit of a fraction of what I have. So one day my wife brings me a present that she found in the flea market. And what is it? She says, I don't know what it is, but it says U.S. Navy on it, so I figured you would love it. And I bought it for you. Turns out to be a sextant. And she says, what is that? I said, it has nothing to do with sex. It is a navigational instrument that you use to shoot the sun, and I know how to use it. And I thank you, because we had a boat, and we were going to use it, and everything was wonderful. And I look at it inside, burned in the wood, it says USS Finback, 230. And I said, not only is it a submarine, not only is it Navy, but it's a submarine, because all the submarines in the Second World War were named after fish. And I owned it for about 8 or 9 years, and then President Bush, thank you, I'm busy with the presidents by now. President Bush ran for vice president the first time, and there was a film clip one night I saw on TV of his TBF bomber getting shot down and lands in the water, and up comes a submarine to pick him up, and it says on the conning tower 230. I sit up a bolt in the bed, and I said, oh my God, that's my thing there, my piece of equipment. So my wife never believes anything. You made up, there you go again. So I said, I'm going to write to the vice president. And I write him a lovely letter, and I tell him I was his constituent, I'm his age, I was in the Navy, and I tell the whole story. I tell him my wife found this thing, and I'm wondering if this is what I saw in the film clip. And you can look at the letter that he sent me way back in 1983 or something. And he said, yes, it was the Finback that picked me up. And they all thought I was drowned because we had radio silence for 30 days because he was on a mission. And I became good friends with the commanding officer, which was Commander Williams of Pensacola, Florida. And he said, I'm still in touch with him, and I'm going to write him and tell him that you have the sextant. Next thing I know, I get a letter from the commander, and he says, I'm so glad that it's in the hands of a Navy man. He said, I never thought I would hear this. And he says, it's the only artifact left from my ship, because it was sunk in the closing days of the war. It's on the bottom of the Sea of Japan. All hands received the Navy Cross for having sunk the most tonnage in that area of the Pacific. And the only reason you have that sextant is because we left it for repairs in Saipan and took a spare. Now I get a letter from the president. Now he's the president. Like, oh no, before that, I get, some time passes and I become pen pals with the president. And I love this. We're doing letters. Those of you who've seen my museum, I got a dozen letters easily from the president. Anyway, and it's nice to see them. They start, "Dear Mr. Pincus," then it's "Dear Albert," now it's "Dear Al." And then he finally tells me in one letter, "I'm not the president anymore, call me George." And I said, "I can't. You're still my president." So anyway, about several years after that, I teach real estate law. I still do now, and I was teaching a class, and something happened that made me tell this story. And after class, this young lady comes up. She says, "I'm also an artist, and I do still life in pen and ink, and I wonder if you'd let me photograph that, because I love that story, and I'd like to make a picture of it." I said, "Sure." She came to my house, photographed it. 6 months later, she brought me that beautiful picture that you see there. And she said, "I made 6 of them. One is in the museum, one is in the library, one is in my home, and this is number 2, and it's for you." I said, "Who got number 1? She said, "Well, the president, of course. And number 3 went to Commander Williams." Now I get 2 more letters. And he said, "Dear Al, what are you going to do with this wonderful sextant now that all this is happening?" Now I'm on the spot, and I write back and I say, "Dear Mr. President, I have thought of giving it to you. But, you know, it's really a part of my museum, a very important part." And I said, "I wonder if you'd mind if I kept it. And if you let me do that, I will leave it in my will to the Smithsonian in your name and mine, together with all the letters and so on." And he wrote back and said, "My wife and I think that's a wonderful idea." And that's when he sent me those 2 pictures of he and his wife and him in the Oval Office, signed by them. And he said, "And let me know when you do that." So when I moved to Pennsylvania and I changed my will, I wrote him, I said, "It's in the will, Mr. President, and I wish you'd come and see it sometime." And he said, "Well, I don't have any plans for Pennsylvania, but you never know. I just might be there. If I do come to Pennsylvania, you'll be sure that I'll come to visit you." So I never take no for an answer. So a couple of weeks ago, I wrote him a letter, and I said, "Now it's George. Dear George, I know you'll be here for the convention in Philadelphia. We're only 40 minutes away." I didn't say I'm inviting, I expect you. And he just might show up. But whether he does or not, that was a wonderful piece of history, so please take a look at that and the other things that I may not have had a chance to tell you about. And do again look at that good-looking kid standing on the shores of Wakanura One. Thank you so much.
Anybody need to take a break? You ready to go? Keep on going? All right, before we introduce our featured speakers, I have just a couple announcements. Pardon? Yeah, we'll get to that too. First of all, I'm not Don Lee. Well, Don's not here. Don took the week off. He went somewhere warm. He's smarter than the rest of us. And since we can talk behind his back, you know, we need to find a way to honor this guy. Joe Nemec brought up a good point. Don has spent nothing but the last 2 years of his life putting this whole World War II lecture series together. Believe me, I see how much work he's put into it. I've only been involved in trying to put this together for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it's a lot of work, and he spent a lot of time. So if anybody's got any good ideas, coming up with some medals or a plaque or something, we can talk about it while he's not here, so we can discuss that after the meeting also. Hope everybody had a chance to look over all the displays that Al Pincus and Art Cable and Walter Hicinbothem, our speakers, put together. There's also some handouts that you may want to take with you before you leave tonight back there. February, we're going to have 2 lectures. We have one coming up February the 1st, which is Sybil Niemöller-von Sell. She's a noted and local author, and she's going to talk about her years growing up in Nazi Germany. There's a little bit more information about what the lecture's about on one of the handouts back there. Also, on February 15th, Warren Kimmel is going to talk about his experiences related to the China-Burma-India theater, which is where we'll get an explanation of what the term flying the hump means. Also, we have a social hour that begins at 5:30. If anybody's interested, and it's a good chance to come out and chat with the veterans and the rest of the people here. On the next one, on the first, we're gonna try and put together what we're gonna call a canteen atmosphere with the Red Cross girls, and maybe have coffee and donuts and things like that. So come out, it should be a lot of fun. Donations are a big part of the lecture series. As we've mentioned before, it's funded only by donations, so all donations are definitely appreciated. As Don would say, dollar bills are great, $5 bills are even better. So, I guess maybe the cold weather kept a few people down tonight. It looks like we have a pretty good crowd. We have a few youngsters in the crowd, I see, and for you young guys, I want you to look around and look at the people around you. You're amongst the generation that Tom Brokaw has rightfully termed the greatest generation. And invite your friends next time and come out and tell them you can come in and sit with some heroes and honor these people. Believe me, they're willing to talk if you're willing to listen, so bring them on out. Before we introduce our speakers, I'd like everybody to join me and stand and pledge allegiance and saluting our flag. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, our two speakers tonight, Art Cable and Walter Hicinbothem, are members of the U.S. submarine veterans of World War II. They're each going to speak. I believe Art's going to start off, and Walt's going to wrap it up. These guys are going to talk about the role of the U.S. submarines and the operations in the Pacific. And believe me, I think that probably most of the glory went to the pilots and the aces, but these are a breed that you probably know very little about, and I think you're going to probably want to learn a little bit more about it after you listen to them. They've never got a lot of recognition, but I think after you listen to them, you're going to see that they honestly deserve it. I guess, Art, are you ready to go? He wants to hold that.
Use this mic. Well, it's okay.
I would say good evening to all of you. When Lee called and asked us to talk about submarine warfare in World War II, we didn't know exactly what to talk about or how to get started on it. We're going to try to give you our insight to the evolution of the submarine, and also Walt will give a talk on the trials and tribulations of being a submarine sailor in Second World War. I'd like to start out by asking a question. What is a submarine? Now I know we got one there and one there that knows what they are, but what is a submarine? A submarine is a surface ship that has the capacity to dive and hopefully surface again. What gives that submarine the capacity to dive and surface? A submarine is nothing more than a long iron tube surrounded by a series of tanks. These tanks are ballast tanks, fuel tanks, lube tanks, freshwater tanks, torpedo recovery tanks, negative tanks, trim tanks, and all those tanks in there are what gives the submarine the capacity to dive. To dive, you got to have negative buoyancy. So that means you got to flood the ballast tanks, and that gives you negative buoyancy, and that'll let you submerge. To surface again, you had to have positive buoyancy. And to get positive buoyancy, you blow the water out of the tanks by high pressure air, thereby giving you positive buoyancy again. And that'll put you up back on the surface, hopefully. If a submarine makes 3,147 dives, how many surfaces is it going to make? Better be one for every dive you made. You better have one to come back up again. Why was the submarine service known as the silent service? It's known as the silent service because during the Second World War, we had a group of senators that came to the Pacific and decided they should have a fact-finding tour. When the fact-finding tour was over, they made a statement to the Honolulu press that the Americans didn't have to worry about their sweethearts in submarines because the Japanese couldn't set their depth charges below 300 feet and the submarines could dive below that depth. Well, that didn't take long to get back to Japan. So then they redesigned their detonators on their depth charges where they could go to 600 feet. And within a period of time, we lost 10 submarines and 10 crews. So you figure if there's 75 to 80 people on a boat, that was 750, 800 good sailors that were lost because of the slip of the tongue. From then on, it was known as a silent service. There was nothing ever was said about submarines being lost to the general public. I'd like to give you a short history of the evolution of the submarine. The first submarine, believe it or not, was a series of leather thongs which were put together, and they had 12 oarsmen with oars sticking out through the leather. They submerged below the surface, and they had reeds, long reeds that went up to the top with floats on them to get them air into the boat. And they could only stay down for a short time because they ran out of air and they ran out of energy to run the paddles. And the next was an egg-shaped ship made by David Bushnell. He had a hand-powered crank which is set acrossways, and they turned this crank, and that turned the propeller. But they couldn't stay down long because they ran out of air. So they had to come back up, get air, and to get the water back out of the boat after they flooded it to go down, they had to take a hand pump and pump the water out. So by the time they submerged and came back up, that left very little time to be below the water. So then they invented a propeller hooked to a gas engine. But the gas engine proved to be a very fatal idea because there was the fumes in the boat would kill more sailors than they would save. But then with the advent of the diesel engine and the advent of the steam torpedo and the ability to have the boat go beneath the water with the ballast tank and had high pressure air to force the water back out again, that's when the true submarine was born. Later on, we had the O-boats, which were a small boat which weighed about approximately 750 tons. And you only had a range of about 600 to 800 miles, so they were used mainly along the shoreline just to protect the shorelines. Then came the S-boat, which was a refinement of the O-boat. And it had a longer range. It it was in about 900 tons. But what they was looking for, the Navy was looking for a submarine which could keep up with the fleet, something that had a range of 5,000 to 8,000 miles. So that was one of the invention, what came along that we known as the fleet boats, and they were strictly experimental boats also. But they were served well at the beginning of the Second World War. You had the Narwhal, the Nautilus, the Argonaut, the Dolphin. All those boats that were made in the 30s were the front-line boats at the beginning of the Second World War. But then when the war broke out, we needed to have a capacity so you could travel at least 10,000 miles to take the war to Japan and then turn around and come back. So we needed extra fuel. So he took number 2 ballast tank, cleaned all the material out of it, wire brushed it, and made that another fuel tank, which would give a submarine about 100,000 gallons of fuel, or enough for about 10,000 mile trip. They stayed, that was the prototype of the whole Second World War submarine. Then after the war, we started working with atomic power, nuclear power for submarines. The first one was the Nautilus, which is now a museum up in New London, Connecticut. That gave them the capacity to stay down as long as 6 months if they had to. And then after that came the nuclear powered boats, which had the 24 missile silos on them. Each missile had 10 warheads. Those warheads, each one was computerized to go to a separate city. That gave one boat, just one boat, the capacity for more destructive power than all the ordnance we dropped in the Second World War from all phases. Now you figure when we had anywhere from 20 to 30 boats with that capacity, that's one reason Russia capitulated and stopped the Cold War. The submarine service consists of approximately 2% of the entire Navy, or approximately 16,000 sailors. But yet we sunk about 65% of the Japanese warships and shipping. That is a record that's hard to believe. I mean, that so few boats could do so much damage. But the price wasn't cheap. We lost 52 submarines and approximately 3,600 men and officers. Our ratio was about 25% fatalities. If you made 3 patrols and come back, you felt lucky. On your 4th one, you figure, well, my time's up. I'm going to be in that 25% this time. But yet many sailors made 8, 9, 10, 12 war patrols and came back to talk about it. At the attack of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese aviators were instructed, do not waste any ordnance on the submarine base and do not touch the fuel farm. Because the Japanese says when we capture Hawaii, we need the fuel for our ships. And the submarine would never ever be a deterrent to them for capturing the Hawaiian Islands, the Aleutian Islands, into Alaska, down the west coast of America, and enslave America in their way of thought. The submarine carried the war to begin with until we could retool and get more fighting ships back in the Pacific. So the submarine did play a very, very important part in the victory over Japan. Thank you. Walter?
Thank you, Art. Isn't this one working?
No. Gotta use that.
Sitting there listening to Alan and Art, couldn't help but notice this interesting flag. Does anybody see what particularly interesting about this flag? Yeah, 48 stars. I thought I could still count right. That's pretty old. I guess we had 50 stars as of the middle 50s. I had a prepared program here, and I will start that in a minute, but Al Pincus triggered a story when he talked about volunteering. I imagine most of us in the audience here, most of the males anyway, were in the service. And you know about volunteering. First rule is that you don't do it. I had to learn the hard way, and I'll just take a second or two to top Al if I can. At quartermaster school, as in boot camp, we did everything by companies. 100 men, a third-class petty officer in charge. We marched to chow, we marched to the drill field, we marched back to our barracks. We did everything. We even got our shots by the company. It's one nice Sunday afternoon up in Newport, our company commander, I remember his first name was Jim, but unfortunately I can't remember his last name. And the 100 of us were standing in the roadway outside the chow hall. And the chow hall and a lot of the barracks in Newport were the old Quonset huts, the great big semicircular huts, and had many cross beams inside holding the thing up. So we were lined up, and Jim says, we have to go in and we have to sweep off all the beams. Somebody said, what do you have to sweep the beams for? He said, well, that's where the cockroaches are. So we lined up, and then he said, well, whoever volunteers to clean those beams off will have the rest of this Sunday afternoon off. Right away, the hand goes up, and about 20 of us put our hands up. We got in ranks, and we marched inside, and as we were going through the door, we heard Jim say to the rest of the company, dismissed for the rest of the afternoon. I never volunteered again. So. I have 100 stories to tell. I promise I won't tell more than 98 or 99 of them. I've acquired these stories not just from my own experience, but from many people who come down to tour on the USS Bakuna at Penn's Landing. John has done that tour guiding, and Art has, and a number of us go down there fairly regularly. So I've accumulated a lot of these stories, and I'll try to keep them in the context of my slight narrative. I would start out by telling you that I thought that when the war broke, when I got into the Navy, that I was a typical American. You know, I had gone to Sunday school, I was a Boy Scout. In fact, I was a junior assistant scoutmaster. I played 3 instruments in our marching band, sang in the choir, did some of the dramatic plays, and numerous other things. I never gave anybody any trouble. I think the worst thing we ever did was to throw stones at the street lights. You know, in those days they didn't have the big globe. They just had a bare bulb sitting there, and when they broke and they hit the oxygen, they gave a beautiful blue light. Didn't do anything more than that. I was a good kid. I went in the Navy, and I found out that I was not the typical kid. We had fellows from the coal mines of Pennsylvania, a tough bunch of guys. They were really tough. We had guys from Iowa who had never been to the ocean. We had fellows that talked kind of funny down there, boy. We had a lot of fellows from Mississippi and Alabama in our boot camp and in the quartermaster school. But I had a fairly normal, easy upbringing, and I was very patriotic, as most of my family was in those days. And so I decided I better get into the Navy. I didn't want to be in the Army with those bayonets sticking in you. So I figured being in the Navy, you wouldn't know what was coming, and if it happened, you wouldn't have to worry about it. We also had no automobiles in those days, which was very interesting. My father was a prison officer. He was in prison, but he was an officer. And my family did travel quite a bit. We went all the way to Niagara Falls. We went to Gettysburg. We lived in New Jersey. We even went into New York City on occasion with an automobile. So I had some travel, but most of the men on board the ship and in the schools had not traveled very much at all. Many of them, probably many from Brooklyn now, who grew up in Brooklyn and thought there was no, once you cross the Harlem River, there were Indians out there. So the Navy changed all that about travel. I put on many thousands of miles in the Navy. I was sent to Newport, Rhode Island for my boot camp, spent 6 weeks in boot camp, and became a sailor in 6 weeks. Somebody, I forget, it was Charleston and I were having a joke about learning the terminology very quickly. You know, within a week you were saluting. If it stood still, you painted it, and if it was moving, you saluted it. We called the floor the deck, the walls the bulkheads, the overhead, the ceilings the overhead. Stairs weren't stairs, they were certainly ladders, and if you said stairs, then you got some duty with that same old paintbrush to go out and do it, or to pick up cigarette butts. Yeah, that was another thing. We all smoked like crazy. I didn't have a cigarette in my mouth until I went in the Navy. Came home with 6 packs. After 6 weeks in the Navy, I had 6 packs stashed away in my arms or in my stockings. Well, I went to Newport in June. We had a grinder or a drill field. It was all dirt, and we had white uniforms, and we had the old khaki leg wear, and they would get dirty. Clean them up in the morning, go out on the drill field, get dirty, and have to go back in and spend another hour scrubbing them clean so it'd be clean for the next morning. It seemed kind of silly to us, but the upshot was that we were drilled, that we had to do what we were told, when we were told, and the best possible way to do it was by getting practiced at it. So we learned that lesson very early. I was assigned after boot camp to quartermaster school, and spent another 3 months there, and I did well enough that after only 4.5 months or so in the Navy, I was a third-class petty officer. That's sort of equivalent to an Army sergeant. Had never been to sea. Here I was a Navy quartermaster, third class. The only reason they needed that was that they had some billets that had to be filled, positions that had to be filled, and the guys that passed the quartermaster course with the most points got to be chosen as a quartermaster or a sergeant third class. Never bossed anybody around, didn't know what I was doing really, and I took a lot of trouble, took a lot of heat because of that. I'll tell that story just a little bit. I need these notes. You know, 3 things you can tell you're getting old. I have trouble hearing, trouble seeing, I can't remember the other one. Okay, I graduated, I went to submarine school in New London, at the submarine base in New London, right out of quartermaster school. That was in January of 1944. And had 3 months of classroom training, after which I graduated, and I was assigned to a USS Blackfin, a real fighting ship, fish. I understand it grows to almost 3 inches and lives in Lake Huron, the only place in the world where it lives. But it was a real fighter. Had to be named on a submarine. Al mentioned before that the ships were named, that were built during World War II, and we built 220 of them during the war. That was in 3.5 years. Nowadays it takes 4 years to build one submarine. So the production really did a job for us in World War II. While she was being built at the Electric Boat Company, about 3 or 4 miles from the sub base, we were assigned to her, and we spent half the day watching the workmen and workwomen putting her together. That way we had a very good understanding of how the ship worked, why the high-pressure pipes went this way, what these valves did, and that sort of thing. It was pretty good duty, really learned a lot, and of course the women didn't hurt either. It was about 40% of the women, they told us, 40% of the workers were women on the submarines, so I felt very lucky about that. Go down and try to find a nice quiet place underneath the deck someplace to see what the women were doing down there. Okay. When I got to submarine school, the first day that we were there, they took us out on an old boat. Art mentioned old boats. It was an old, I think it was as old as World War I. They took us out in Long Island Sound and took us down 80 feet under the water. They said to stay out of their way while we were diving. So they shoved me behind a watertight door. All I could do was look out over the top of the thing and see these guys turning valves all over the place. And surprisingly enough, almost a quarter of the submariners, or the new submariners, failed that part of the test. They didn't like it. They said they didn't want to do it, and by the time the next day rolled around, they weren't with us in submarine school. But I was kind of thick, and I'm young and naive, I guess, and I just said, yeah, this was great. So I went back to school. In 2 or 3 days, they put us in a compression chamber. They took us up to about 50 pounds per square inch to see whether physiologically we could stand pressure if necessary. The only time we had to really worry about it in the submarine service was when we were, very few people did it, but if there was an opportunity to escape from a sunken submarine, we would be able to stand the pressure. Then when we passed the compression test, which was about 50 pounds per square inch, they put us in a chamber, compressed us to about 25 pounds per square inch, and then we swam out of the tank and swam up to a 100-foot tower at New London. We only had to go up to the 50-foot level, but some of the fellows had to go up to the 100-foot level. That was quite an experience. You come out and you look up, and there's this little tiny hole up at the top, and as you went slowly up the line, trying to escape, we had an air mask. The hole got bigger and bigger until we got to the top. It turned out that it was about 10 feet in diameter, but I always remember that it was looked about that big to me. Yeah, and two, it was cold. Imagine, this was January. Navy doesn't issue insulated underwear, so we had our Navy trunks on and swam up. By the time we got to the 50-foot level, we had to walk across a catwalk. The Navy doesn't put rugs down either. So we walked across this metal catwalk, which was covered with ice, in our bare feet and our swim trunks. So we were beginning to think that Navy was trying to get us ready for something. Finally, in June, we were set to go. Backfin was all set to go. We had been commissioned on, no, not June, it was July. We were commissioned on July 4th of 1944. We were all set to go, and at the last minute, we found trouble with the periscopes. So what are we going to do? They gave us liberty. This was a Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock. We take off for New York. Well, everybody wanted to go see what New York was like. Well, as luck would have it, 3 of us got together, and we ran into three girls. We didn't have to be back to the Navy until 6 o'clock on Monday morning. So what were we going to do? We wound up staying at these 3 girls' houses, and absolutely nothing happened, folks. Absolutely nothing happened. Yeah. During the week, somebody spiked the other periscope, so... really, something did go wrong with the second periscope. So we got another weekend. In the meantime, I had been talking to my folks who lived in near Elizabeth, New Jersey. I said, why don't you come home, Walter, you know? Don't tell us a story about visiting the girls in New York. If you're that close, you better come on home. So I did that. And my mother never forgot it. She just died last month. I'm sure she'd be glad if I told that story to you. She was almost 98. Okay, then we sailed out to Pearl Harbor through the canal, through the Panama Canal. Navy has rankings. You know, the higher you are, the more perks you have. And if there's a job that has a great benefit, the guy with the higher ranking or the higher seniority wins it. So I was stuck inside the submarine on the helm. That was my job, maneuvering station helmsman. I spent the whole time through the Panama Canal inside a submarine with only the light from the sky shining down through the conning tower on me. And I never forgave that guy, Jim Durrance. His name was also Jim Durrance. I never forgave him, but he had the rank on me. I got even with him later on. We went through the Panama Canal, and we stayed on the other side of the Pacific side of the canal. And they can tell whether that's the north or the south side, but it's the Pacific side at any rate. And we were given liberty. And I tell you, I've been scared a few times in my life. Once was the day I got married. And the other time was really, really tough, was in Panama. It was a terrible place to be. Maybe it still is, I don't know. But it was a terrible place to be at that time, especially for a sailor, and thousands of them overrunning the place. The red light district didn't have any caution light before you got there. People were stabbed. People were mugged. and some fellows never came back from Liberty. So I stayed on board ship the next 3 nights. We went gunnery shooting each day. There's a little island off the Panama Canal. We had 5-inch guns on board the Blackfin, and we couldn't hit this little island. They were 5-inch 25s. They were not known for their accuracy, but they did have a lot of explosive power. So we did hit this little island, but not very often. Skipper was pretty upset about it, so we spent 2 days when we got to Pearl. We spent 2 days out having gunnery practice. That's the Navy way. When we got to Pearl Harbor, we spent 10 days, and I remember it was 10 days because it was a brutal 10 days. We went out to sea every morning. We steamed out to sea, and every night we came back into port. But while we were out at sea, we constantly drilled. Collision drills, fire drills. John's smirking over there. He knows what I mean. And you never stop. You lay down in your bunk and you go to sleep for 15 minutes, and the collision alarm sounds, and without even waking up, you run through the ship. We had priority. The most important jobs went first, and you had priority. And I would still be awake when I put my hands on the helm, and then I'd finally wake up. But we got numb. The Navy, again, the Navy way was to drill you until you did things automatically, and after a while it became second nature. Found out Hawaii was also a great place. We went to Honolulu on Liberty, and there was a curfew, but the islands were so beautiful that my wife and I now, we've been back 9 times. We try to go back as often as we can, and we still find it a delightful place. Okay, we took off on our first patrol, and our station was off Manila Bay on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. We were fortunate. We were submerged one day at 100 feet, and the sound picked up a propeller sound, and we made a submerged approach on a 4,000-ton tanker, fired 3 torpedoes and hit her with 1, and she sank. We dove deep, a little bit deeper than that 300 feet Art was talking about, and depth charges were dropped on us, but they were so far away from us that they sounded like the hand grenades that we had used in practice. All us young guys said, boy, this is easy, just like we practiced back in New London. And the old guys said, just wait, just wait. We spent about 35 days off Manila, the entrance to Manila Bay, and then we went down to a channel called the Mindoro Channel between the island of Mindoro and Luzon. It's about 100 miles south of Manila. We had orders to pick up 8 guerrillas from the island of Mindoro. They had gathered information against the Japanese. People don't know this, but the Japanese conquered many areas of the South Pacific, but they didn't occupy all of the places. Mindoro Island was one where they had about 15,000 Americans and Filipinos and hundreds of nurses, American nurses, on the island that the Jap just left there. They weren't doing any harm, but they were gathering very much information about airplanes, routes, and ships in the area. We picked up that information and delivered it to Perth eventually. The channel ran at about 3.5 knots. Submerged, if we ran at 3.5 knots to counterbalance that current, we would run out of our battery before nighttime came again, when we could surface and recharge. So it was a constant battle while we were there under submerged. We got in, missed the signal with the guerrillas, and had to spend a whole day in the channel sweating that out. Finally, the skipper said, I don't care. We need the battery power. We better surface and recharge. Fortunately, no planes met us, and we did rendezvous with the 8 guerrillas and loaded them down with all the candy and cigarettes that we had left. The poor guys didn't have anything. Really pretty scroungy-looking bunch. They'd been living in the jungle, essentially. And we had these big bags of secret information. Leaving the island of Mindoro, we went down through all the seas, the Sulu Sea, through the Malacca Strait, past the island of Timor, and then down through a strait between the island of Bali and Lombok. Very romantic sounding. Bali was always, the dancing girls and all. The Lombok Strait was about 20 miles wide and had a fast current going in both directions as the tide changed it. It was very fast. And it was well patrolled by the Japanese. We could see their radar trying to pick on us. That was a very awkward night, trying to race through there, hoping that the radar couldn't pick us up in time to send out a ship to challenge us. There was one other major strait between all those South Pacific islands, but Lombok was the one that we always used. We stopped in Darwin. This is the travel I mentioned. I didn't get too much of when I was a kid, but here I am in Port Darwin with ships still sunk in the harbor with their masts sticking out of the water. It was at 8 degrees south latitude, and we all had a chance to go up topside. Finally, we had been with 74 days without actually seeing the sun for real, except through the periscope. So we all went outside and laid down on the deck, soak up that good old Darwin sun, and several of us got sun poisoning. We just laid there too damn long. That was the whole problem. It felt so good to feel the sun on your back. But then we got down to Perth, Australia, and let me tell you, Perth, Australia is second best place. Has anybody here been to Australia besides me? John, you guys submariners? Excuse me. And the city of Perth is up a river, I think it's the Swan River, and the port for it is called Fremantle. Well, the first patrol we were there, we stayed in the King George Hotel in downtown Perth, and we came to understand that it had been a place of not the best reputation, but the American sailors made it even a worse reputation, I guess. Because, people in Australia and the United States military people got along famously. They're very much like what we thought our country was 50 years ago. The Australian girls loved us. We loved the Australian girls, literally. And we just had a grand time while we were down there. We had 2 weeks of complete rest leave doing nothing. We were completely on our own. Food was very cheap. There wasn't an awful lot of good food, but they had plenty to eat. There was a lot of good food because of the wartime. Best part of it all was that the marriageable men, I guess you would call the eligible men, were all fighting up in the jungles, and most of the men that were left were just the old, what they called the home guard. And we spent a few nights in air raid drills, in air raid shelters. Down there, the soil was very sandy. They'd dig a big hole and they just put a heavy wooden roof over it. It was a handy place for other things besides air raid drills too. Like the homeless urinating, things like that. Okay, we're down to number 99 now. We got ready for our second patrol, and our skipper, George Laird, I don't know why, but veterans can remember most of the names of their skippers and commanders pretty easily. Is that right, gentlemen? And our second in command, Conde Regay, was a real martinet, but a very good submariner. He was given a command of the USS Barbell. About 6 months later, we were on station on one side of the Balabac Strait between the island of Balabac and Mindoro, and the Barbell was on the other side. It was attacked by an airplane. We heard the explosions. It seemed to be about 20 miles away, and Conde and his crew were lost. We didn't know that definitely until we got back from patrol, and it left a big pain in our heart, knowing that we had served with Conde and that he had gone down. He and the whole crew had gone down. All right, on our second patrol, we acquired Bill Kitch, who was a grand man. He's still living, lives in York, Pennsylvania, and he was just the greatest guy you'd ever want to work for. And we all, I guess the word is loved, but we did love him. We picked up a 90-day one named Kurt Bunting, another grand guy, but he had been a shoe salesman before he went in the service. He had graduated college and was a shoe salesman and turned out to be a darn good executive officer on the ship. I worked very closely with him. Kurt died just 2 years ago, and he was head of the Eastern Seaboard Lighthouse memorial service, some sort of a fund organized to collect money to preserve all the lighthouses on the Eastern Seaboard, especially around New England. On our second patrol, we went off to the west side of the Malay Peninsula. It was at the bottom of the South China Sea. And we were attacked by a destroyer. They spotted us, and they got to about 700 yards coming straight at us to ram us. We fired a torpedo, and I remember being on the battle station. I can remember it very clearly. And we stood in the conning tower, and there was a ladder, not a stairs, a ladder that went up to the bridge. It was only about 10 feet from where I was. The skipper could holler down commands to me and to the plainsman. And he said, we hit with the second torpedo. There's black smoke, and there's white smoke, and there's nothing there. Within 2 minutes, the destroyer Shiguri, a Shiguri-class submarine, I should say, was gone in 2 minutes. At 700 yards, that's only 2,000 feet from where he was trying to ram us. So that was a pretty close call, but it made our second run also a successful run. Okay, at the end of the second patrol, we were sent to the center of the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a great big area between the mainland of China and Singapore and all the other islands of Borneo and the Philippines. The big centers, they said there would be a map here, but if somebody's interested, I brought an old fold-out map. I can show you where we were. We put a picket line across the South China Sea, submarine at about every 20 miles. And our job was to intersect or to spot any Japanese fleet that was coming up from the southern part of the South China Sea. We did spot by radar and then eventually by periscope, but the Blackfin did detect the fleet coming north, but we had orders to get away. The first submarine to spot them had orders to get away and radio in. You were not supposed to attack. It was a big disappointment to us because by the time I got out in the war, I'm one of the young guys, Art's from the older class here. By the time I got out there, the Japanese the targets were not very numerous. So we were kind of disappointed, but we did what we were told to do. Okay, then we went from that ended our second patrol, and we went to Subic Bay, which is a little bit north of Manila Bay in the Philippines, and we went into Subic Bay. We were the Blackfin was the second submarine to go back into Subic Bay. We had a rest leave there, such as it was. We played softball on the beach. Our great entertainment was watching the American airplanes going south to the Bataan Peninsula to bomb the remaining Japanese. It was sort of a reversal of fortune. The Japanese did it to us at the beginning of the war, and we did it to them at the end. And we'd listen, hear the planes, the bombers, look up and watch them go over and then play another couple of innings of softball. And they gave us Iron City beer, too, a couple of cases of that. And then we'd hear the planes coming. We'd hear the explosions. It was about 25 or 50 miles south. We'd hear the explosions, and then we'd look up and watch the planes come back. The Americans have a real cool, don't they? I don't know, we just didn't realize what was going on, but we took the fun when we could get it. Because I would like you to leave you with the feeling how cruddy, dirty, smelly, hot, stinky job being in a submarine really was. We never realized it until we got out into the fresh air or when we came back from relief and had to go back down into the ship. It really was a pretty bad odor. There were sanitary problems. There were gases of all kinds, static, diesel oil, which I still smell when I take the first step down into the submarine on the weekends down here at Penn's Landing. I swear I can still smell it. Right, John? And so when it came a chance to do something for fun, submarine sailors were among the best to take advantage of it. And 2 weeks out of about 3 months wasn't all that much time to have fun, but we made the most of it. I got to tell you one of the 99 stories. I fell in love in Honolulu. There was a theater called the Waikiki Theater. It was about a block away from the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. You know, that costs $600 a night to stay now. I got it for nothing. I was on the third floor balcony looking right over. And in the theater was a story called National Velvet. And the interesting thing about this theater was that in the lobby there was a palm tree that grew right through the roof. They just built the roof around the palm tree. And of course, you know the story there. There was 12-year-old, what's her name? I'm still in love with her. So she was an exciting young lady, and it was a great movie, and it was one of the things I remember most from Honolulu. My wife doesn't enjoy me telling that story, and I couldn't have told you she was going to be here, but she's coming down with a bad cold. Anyway, we went back from Subic Bay. We went out on our third patrol, and we got down off Cameron Bay. You all remember Cameron Bay. And three little islands called the Little Brothers, about 150 miles east of Cameron Bay. And we spotted that we were in a three-submarine pack. We didn't call them wolf packs, but we were in groups of three. And we spotted this small convoy coming out of Cameron Bay. And I mentioned about priority and perks. The oldest skipper, the highest ranking skipper, got to go in on this target first. Then the second was. Well, Bill Kitch was, as I told you, just a brand new skipper. We went in third, but you can imagine by the time we got there, the Japanese were alerted and ready for us. They proceeded to depth charge us with over 60 depth charges. We don't know exactly because sometimes 2 depth charges explode as 1. So we received a very extensive depth charging, the worst beating that we had taken against us during the whole war. Eventually, Captain Kitch said, well, let's put her on the bottom. So we went down on the bottom and stayed down for many hours until we were sure that the Japanese probably had left. You never could be certain 100%. It took us 2 hours to rocket the boat out of the bottom. We had 1,500 tons, actually 2,300 tons underwater, sinking down into the bottom of the ocean, and the smooth hull that had created a tight fit. So there was a lot of suction trying to get loose. And we didn't want to use too much air up, give away the air bubbles up to the surface. So we would run from one end of the ship, they'd blow a little air in the bow, and then we'd run to the back end. And eventually, after about 2 hours, we broke loose. But we were badly damaged. We had both our periscopes were knocked off. Our guns had been knocked askew. Our propeller shafts had been twisted, and we had water coming in at a good rate from around the propeller shafts. So we were ordered back again to Perth, which was hard duty to take, right? I told you about those Australians. They all ran for the air raid shelters, I guess. But that was an interesting time. We stayed on the Indian Ocean at the Ocean Beach Hotel. Am I talking too long? And we stayed at the Ocean Beach Hotel. It was on the Indian Ocean. We walked across the street and we were right there. It was a marvelous beach and a place where many of the locals came out. They had an American dance hall a couple of blocks away from the hotel. And it was there that when April 12th, I think it was, that we got the news that President Roosevelt had died. And we were so upset about that we all rolled over and went back to sleep. We were 18 years old, and President Roosevelt didn't, really 19 years old, didn't mean much to us. And it stuck in my mind years later how unsure we were of what was going on. We had nice beach parties. We had a big fight at the American Dance Hall. Those are the highlights of my trip to Fremantle. We also had a ride in a charcoal automobile. They had big furnaces that stood about this high. They stuck on the back of the automobile, and they used the gases coming off the charcoal that they were burning. They used that to drive the engines. They were not too bad. They were a little stinky, as you can imagine. They weren't too bad, except going up a hill. And you'd have to get all 4 sailors out of the cab and run up the hill, pushing the car to get it up to the top. I'm not kidding. That's the way you got around. And that was kind of tough if you'd been drinking too much. So. The Ocean Beach Hotel was great because we stayed there, and as they had a curfew. I think it was from between 4 and 6 o'clock at night, and then only up until 9 o'clock at night. They were not allowed to serve beer. but the barmaids at our hotel who knew us for the 2 weeks rigged up a way to have a half a door at the back of the bar in the storeroom, and we could come in through the bottom of that door and sit back there and drink beer between 4 and 6 o'clock. It avoided fights, too, because one crew would come in and drink, somebody would say something to the crew of another submarine, and the first thing you know, it'd be a big fight. None of those guys that I stood up for, do I remember their names or where they are now. Didn't mean a thing as it turned out. We went from Fremantle on our 4th patrol, but the engineering repairs had been so bad that we couldn't function. Our propellers were very noisy. So they sent us back. We were told we were going back to the mainland, to the States. We called them the States in those days. Nowadays, if you say that out in Hawaii, I'm going back to the States, they hit you. It's always the mainland. So we had to go back to Pearl, and they stopped us at Pearl and fixed us up and said, now, go out, but don't go deeper than 300 feet because you have cracks in the conning tower. It was the end of the war was coming, and they knew it, and they just wanted all the vessels out there. It was safe enough to go down to 300 feet, I guess, I hope. But we were sent into water where it was not that deep. It was maybe 30 fathoms deep, and we... after they repaired us, they sent us back out to Saipan. We picked up a frequency-modulated sonar. It was a high-frequency sonar that we could detect mines in the water. There's a string, just like the Aleutian Islands are a big semicircle coming down from Alaska toward Japan. At the southern end of Japan, there's a string of islands curving the opposite way called the Ryukyus, and also called the Nancy Shoto, or archipelago. And we had to go between these islands through all the minefields that the Japanese had. So they had a light would come on when they detected a mine, and at the same time it would ring a bell. So very quickly American sailors started calling them Hell's Bells, because they would ring bing here, you'd shift the bow a little bit and you'd sneak through the minefields that way. The mines were the hairiest things that I can remember. We would surface, stick up the periscope as soon as possible, and on more than one occasion, downscope and take her down. There'd be a mine floating right near the bow of the submarine. So that was scary because you couldn't really see them. While we were in the Yellow Sea, actually the East China Sea, we got word that the atomic bomb had been dropped. We were about 300 miles west of Shanghai toward Japan. So I've estimated on the map that we were about 500 to 600 miles from the second bomb at Nagasaki. The atomic bomb was dropped. We got the radio report, and we didn't have copiers in those days, so the yeoman made carbon copies and distributed them to the ship and said, keep them, these will be important. I never kept mine, so I missed out on a good piece. But it said atomic in quotes. We had no idea what an atomic bomb was at that time. All we knew is that the report said that the war was just about over. And it was for me. They kept me in the Navy for a little while longer. They stretched me out to about 6 months after the war before they discharged me. And I would like to wind up by saying that I had a tremendous experience. Things I had never done. This naive little boy who played instruments in the band, went to Sunday school till he was 16, had seen in 2.5 years more than most people get to see in their lifetime. Had a lot of activities, a lot of great things, and in the submarine service, not too many bad things happened to you if you came back. As Art pointed out, 12 of our 52 boats that were lost with all hands. So the chances of coming back were either 100% or 0%. Looking back, I guess that was the best way to be. I never saw the enemy Japs, and we called them Japs in those days. I've been corrected, politically corrected, but I still say, speaking about the wartime, they were the Japs. The only Japs I saw were 3 prisoners of war working on the dock when we pulled into Saipan. That's another little story I'll tell somebody after I'm done talking here. And we saw on Saipan, we had a concentration camp for the locals, who were the Chamorros, who were very anti-American. They were very scared of us. When we went near them, they would throw rocks and spit at us. But they were at enough of a distance, I really can't say that I saw that they were Japanese. I think they were just local sugarcane workers. Went back to San Diego, went home on 30 days leave. then shipped me all the way back out to Hawaii to sit and wait for discharge. Typical Navy stuff. And but I got to see a lot of great baseball players, like Johnny Mize and Pushima Tony Lombardi, and there were several others I can't quite think of, because they were out there in the service, getting credit for service, but they were playing ball to entertain the rest of us. Finally got back on an aircraft carrier. I sat in a PBY on the flight deck as we went under the Golden Gate, and as far as I'm concerned, that was the end of my wartime experience. I was back in the States. That's all I have to say, but if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than delighted to ask Art and John or myself. Yes, sir.
You mentioned you and another sub were out there on different positions, and the other sub was spotted by an aircraft. Was it on the surface when it was spotted? How was it spotted? Were you on the surface?
We were spotted on. We had this periscope that could be tilted up when we were submerged to look for a sky scan, but no, the ones that attacked us were on the surface. The submarines were on the surface, and they spotted us, and our lookouts picked them up, thank gosh. As I've mentioned to a couple of people here, we were bombed 3 times, once by the Japanese and twice by American pilots. Toward the end of the war, they were so desperate as we were to find targets that that's a submarine, and from the air, a submarine is a submarine, you know. So the Japanese guy dropped a 50-pound bomb. We know how big it was because with the tail fin stuck in our deck. The explosion didn't amount to very much, just scared us a little bit. John, let me ask the stranger here. People we haven't seen before, I'm sorry. The lady here, please.
If we'd have had good torpedoes at the beginning of the war, would we have shortened it?
Well, I'm no great diplomat or politician, but all that I've heard is yes. It took about 1.5 years to get the torpedoes corrected. We had several things that were wrong with them. They wouldn't explode. The magnetic detonator wouldn't explode. They went premature. 2 of them, in fact, 2 of them circled and sank the ship. The Tang, the USS Tang and the USS Tullabee were sunk by their own torpedo. In the case of the Tang, 13 men escaped. 9 survived getting off the ship and survived in the prisoner of war camp. Captain, I guess he's an admiral, Dick O'Kane, has written a couple of books. You might want to look that up. O'Kane, O''Kane. He's written a couple of good stories. Maybe the library has some copies here. They're great to do. But there were so many targets out there that when one Japanese commercial vessel, a big ship, went back into Yokohama with a torpedo sticking in its side, had not exploded. Now, you know, a big ship like that carried a lot of men or a lot of materiel, and the Japanese absolutely depended on their fleet. It was their Achilles heel, really. So the bad torpedoes, bad operating torpedoes was a real loss for us. This young lady here.
Even with the one that outranked you, Panama will let